All right, well, what about doing cos and its inverse? So again, you can see from the screen here that I have this function y equals cos x. So I've drawn in the cos graph, or the book has drawn in the cos graph here. And again, because you want it to have an inverse, you only want it to have, be a one-to-one function. So the easiest place to make cos a one-to-one function is by doing it from a domain of 0 to pi. So we do that 0 to pi and we get cos. And you can see that if we move that across to the second graph here, it's drawn in. I'm just going over it in yellow. Okay. So again, to do the inverse, we're just going to take x and y points along that and reverse them. So if I start from the end point, the first end point was 0, 1. So this point here is 1, 0. So we mark in the point 1, 0. We go along the cos graph. This point here is pi on 2, 0. So reverse it and you will get 0 pi on 2. And then the last end point is pi minus 1. So reverse that and you will get minus 1 pi. Okay. Mark in the line y equals x, and you can see they've marked that in for you. And then your inverse graph looks for cos, looks like this. So I've gone over it there in blue. So again, have a look at what your domain is. So we're looking just at the blue graph. You know what I've gone over in that blue highlighter. So the domain is from the lowest value is, always go from lowest to highest, -1 to 1. And the range, okay, so the range is different to the inverse sign. So the range goes from 0 to pi. And you can see in the third graph that they've drawn this out as y equals cos to the minus 1 of x. Okay, now just reading their notes for domain. You get a highlighter here for domain. The domain of cos to the minus 1 is the range of the restricted cosine function between -1 and 1. And so remember, we restricted the cosine function. We restricted that cosine function to make sure that it was a 1-to-1. And you can see its range there is. Its range is from -1 to 1. For the range was obviously whatever the domain of the cosine function was. So the domain of the cosine function to make it 1-to-1 was 0 to pi. So therefore, that becomes the range. I'll go over it, highlight again. So that becomes the range of the cos to the minus 1 graph. Now there's a little thing here that composition. So this part here, and you'll get quite a few questions that relate to that. So this composition is saying, read from the inside of the bracket. Do cos to the minus 1 of x. So do the inverse cos, and then take the cos of that. Okay, well clearly that's got to be x. So whatever you've done this inverse cos. So you've found the angle, and then you've taken the cos of it. So you're going to be back with whatever x was, and that's true for all x between -1 and 1. And the reason that is if we're doing this is like doing an f of g of x. So the domain of the composite function is the domain of what the part in the bracket is. So the domain of that is -1 to 1. All right, if you do cos to the minus 1, if you do it the other way around, so if you start with cos x and then do cos to the minus 1 out of it, it will be x, but remember the domain will be whatever the domain is for cos x. So you've got to look at the cos x graph, the domain of that is 0 to pi. So these people find these things a little bit tricky in the beginning. So take the time, make sure you understand what's happening in that in function notation, and that will make your life a little bit easier.